Hi everyone, and welcome to another crime and punishment story. This week I am covering the story of William James Cavanagh alias Thompson, James Innes and Ruby Wright, and the murder of Henry Hollier in Newcastle upon Tyne in 1917. But before we begin, can I just say, if you enjoy this video then please give it a thumbs up, and if you are new here or haven't already done so, then please do consider subscribing to the channel to help support the content we create. Thank you. I would also like to add that there was a lot of information about the case, but there was very little detail in the old newspaper articles, so I've had to use other sources for the story, so it may not be quite as detailed in some places such as the inquest and the trial as what my normal stories are, but I hope you will still enjoy it. As this crime involves more than one person, I will include a little basic information about them all. Ruby Wright was born in around 1891 in Glasgow in Scotland and was said to be around 26 years old in 1917. She worked as a barmaid in Newcastle, though it is also likely that she was, as they would have said in those days, working the streets. She also claimed to be married to William Cavanagh, but it is unlikely that she was. She had previously been arrested in 1912 for using offensive language, for which she had been fined 10 shillings and costs. James Innes was born in around 1889, also in Glasgow, and worked as a fitter. He was said to be around 28 years old in 1917. He had been arrested many times before for things such as theft and assault. His life of crime appeared to begin in around 1905 in Glasgow, where his first charge of theft had seen him sentenced to 14 days in prison. William Cavanagh was born in around 1888, also in Glasgow. He was said to be around 29 years old in 1917, and he was described as being around 5'3" tall. His job was given as a cook, but it is very doubtful that he had ever actually worked as one, as he spent most of his time in prison. He had a very long list of previous crimes, starting in 1903 when he had been bound over for theft in Glasgow. He mostly appeared to be a petty thief, but many of his crimes also involved assault, including a stabbing case in 1910 in Glasgow. From 1903 until 1916 he was in and out of prison on a regular basis, with his last prison stay being 3 months, which he'd been given in May of 1916. There are no reasons given as to why the three had moved from Glasgow to the northeast. However, they did seem to travel from place to place quite a lot, no doubt looking for places where they were less well known to continue their life of crime. Henry Hollier, the victim, was born in Essex in July of 1889 to parents Matthew and Anne, or Annie, and he was one of 13 children. He had previously worked as a house painter, but by 1917 he was a painter second class in the Royal Navy. He had joined the Navy in around 1913 and had signed on for 12 years. He was described in his sign-up papers as being around 5'4" tall, with brown hair and blue eyes. At the time of the crime he was on shore leave in Newcastle with several other men from his ship. On Wednesday night, June the 20th, 1917, 4 sailors left the ship which was on the Tyne at Newcastle quayside and went into the town for a few drinks. The men were Alfred Gough, Burling, Grant and MacDonald. Only Alfred's Christian name was known. They went into the Mechanic's Arms at around 8:30 p.m. and it was here that they were later joined by Henry Hollier. They were drinking with a group of ladies: Sarah Shearer, Isabella Smith, Muriel Brown, who was also sometimes known as Margaret, and Ruby Wright. They were enjoying their evening, but as the night wore on, it was suggested by Ruby Wright that they went back to her house in West Street in Newcastle, where they could carry on drinking. They all decided that this was a good idea. The party was going well, and there was even a little bit of singing going on. Around an hour after arriving at the house, 2 more people turned up. The new arrivals were James Innes and William Cavanagh. William was introduced to the group as being Ruby's husband and James as his close friend. Ruby opened a bottle of whiskey and the men and women continued enjoying their evening until it was said that one of the women present, no name was ever given, made a remark that James and William should really be fighting for their country. Two of the sailors also said something along the same lines and an argument broke out. At first it was just shouting, but then it became physical. Three of the men, Grant, MacDonald and Innes, left the house and were followed by two of the women. It was here outside that James punched MacDonald and knocked him to the ground. He, James, then went back inside the house. Inside, William had also punched Henry and knocked him out, and he was lying on the ground. Alfred Gough tried to intervene, but William had by now pulled a knife from his pocket and lashed out at Alfred, cutting him on the face. He then stabbed Henry in the back while he was still lying on the ground. Henry was then carried outside into the yard and left on the ground outside. Alfred Gough, still bleeding from his wound, went to find a policeman. By this time only William, James and Ruby were still inside the house, as the others had all left shortly after the fight started, with most of the sailors, apart from Alfred Gough, having gone back to the ship. Sergeant Daly and an unnamed constable went to the house and were followed by Inspector Wood soon after. They found Henry lying in the yard at the back of the house in a pool of blood. He was not moving and they could see he was seriously injured. They very quickly sent him to hospital. He was sent to the 1st Northern General in Newcastle. This was a building that had actually been built as the Armstrong College, but it had been taken over by the military at the start of World War I as a hospital for the servicemen. The police also found James Innes passed out on a bed in the house with his arm bandaged, and Ruby and William were found asleep in the house as well. All three were arrested for unlawfully wounding Henry Hollier and Alfred Gough. At their first appearance at the police court on June the 21st, William Cavanagh was charged with unlawfully wounding Henry Hollier and Alfred Gough. Ruby Wright was charged with assaulting Berlin and Alfred Gough by apparently throwing glasses and bottles at them. James Innes was also charged with unlawfully wounding Henry Hollier and MacDonald. They were then remanded in custody for 8 days. However, on June the 25th, Henry Hollier died of his wounds at the General Hospital, resulting in both William and James being charged with wilful murder. The inquest was held on July the 11th, 1917 at the New Infirmary before the coroner Alfred Appleby. The new infirmary would of course be the RVI, or to give it its full name, the Royal Victoria Infirmary. The hospital had recently replaced the old infirmary at Forth Banks. The main witnesses were those who had been present at the house on the night the crime took place. There is little to no detailed information of what they said. However, it is clear that they described the argument which resulted in the fight between the civilians, William and James, and the 5 sailors. The 4 surviving sailors would all go on to name William as the man who had stabbed Henry, though it must be noted here that 2 of them had been outside at the time of the attack, so had probably seen little to nothing. The police gave evidence of finding the body of Henry outside in the yard. He was alone when they found him, and on examining him, they realised that he had been stabbed in the back several times. The doctor at the hospital would state that 2 of the stab wounds had pierced the heart of Henry Hollier, and these wounds had been the cause of his death. It was stated that they had operated on Henry on June the 21st, when the wounds in his heart had been stitched, but sadly this had not been enough to save his life, and he had died a few short days later. The jury very quickly returned a verdict of wilful murder, and William Cavanagh and James Innes were committed for trial. It was decided at this time that William, James and Ruby Wright, Ruby was still on a charge of assault, would all stand in the dock together at the next assizes. Henry Hollier was buried in St Andrew's Churchyard in Jesmond, Newcastle upon Tyne. He has a headstone, which is a World War I headstone, the same as all the others surrounding him. There is no mention of his cause of death on his memorial. The photo on the screen at the moment is one I took recently. I often find it very strange and sometimes quite emotional, standing at the graveside of someone who has been murdered that I am writing about, and this was no different. The trial took place at Newcastle before Mr. Justice Salter in early November 1917. The prosecution quickly stated they had no real evidence against Ruby Wright, and she was acquitted on the judge's orders and free to leave. Both William and James pleaded not guilty to willful murder. The four sailors again gave evidence of their night with Henry Hollier and the woman they had met in the Mechanic's Arms. They stated that before they went to Ruby's house in West Street, they had called at a fish and chip shop in Blenheim Street. They had all been in good spirits and everyone in the company at that point in time was friendly. All four denied that they had been drunk on the night in question, stating that they had not had much to drink at the public house, and they said the whiskey they had been drinking at Ruby's home had been provided by Ruby herself, which they believed she had in the house before they arrived, and that this had been shared by all those present that night. Petty Officer Burling said he had seen William deliberately stab Arthur and that Ruby had thrown glasses at him. MacDonald said that James Innes had hit him so hard that he had knocked some of his teeth out. There are no details about any of the evidence given by Grant. Alfred Goff said that he had seen William strike Henry in the face and knock him down. He himself had tried to calm things down. When he tried to break up the fight between William and Henry, William had taken a penknife from his waistcoat pocket and stabbed him in the cheek. Henry was still lying on the floor at this point, and it was then that he saw William deliberately stab him in the back several times with the penknife. He said that he had then been kicked by James Innes, and all the time this was going on, Ruby was throwing glasses at anyone within her reach. Alfred Goff said that it was he who had gone to the police station and reported the events at the house in West Street. Inspector Wood stated that he had found a blood-stained penknife on a table in the house, and that the clothing of both William and Ruby was stained with blood. James Innes, he said, did not have any blood on his clothing. Captain Armstrong of the RAMC, which stands for the Royal Army Medical Corps, stated that Henry had 5 wounds. Some of the reports state 6 and some say 7. Apart from those that had penetrated his heart, he also had one in the left side of the neck, another near the liver, and another near the right kidney. He believed that from the evidence given by Alfred Goff, the first wound inflicted by William Cavanagh had been the one beside the kidney. Ruby Wright would return to the courtroom, but this time as a witness. She stated she had been the one to tell William and James to take Henry and place him outside in the yard. She also admitted that she had seen William hitting Henry several times, but she did not see him using a knife. When cross-examined, she said she simply could not see a knife in his hand. She also claimed that the sailors had not been sober. She said they had in fact been very drunk. She said not only had they had more than one bottle of whiskey between them, but that they had also had a lot to drink earlier in the Mechanic's Arms. She did not believe them when they had claimed to be quite sober on the night, and she also believed that it had been Henry who had lashed out at William first. Of course, it is worth remembering here that Ruby had claimed to be the wife of William and was at the very least a good friend, so she no doubt had a sense of loyalty towards him and may have twisted the truth a little with her evidence. Although William and James did not give evidence, they both claimed they had not meant to cause the death of Henry Hollier and that it had simply been an accident. The jury retired for just a short while, and on their return they gave a verdict of not guilty with regard to James Innes, and he was free to go. However, they returned a verdict of guilty of willful murder against William Cavanagh, with a strong recommendation to mercy. The judge then sentenced him to death by hanging, and that his remains would be buried within the grounds of Newcastle Prison. William was then taken from the dock and returned to the prison. William attempted to appeal the decision. It was claimed by his solicitors that his reputation may have caused the jury to find him guilty. He had, as mentioned at the start of this story, quite a string of offences over the previous years. This had not been revealed to the jury at the trial, and it was actually thought that they would not have recommended mercy had they known of his previous convictions. But the solicitors thought William was well known in the area, so the jury would have known of his past. I have to say that most of William's arrests were in Glasgow or Belfast, with just a couple in the northeast area, so it would seem hard to believe that people in the area would have known of his reputation at the trial. The solicitor also suggested that the sailors had clearly lied about being sober, so their evidence about what had happened during the fight could not be believed. This, however, was quickly rejected by the magistrates. Their final reason for an appeal was that William had not been aware of the knife in his hand. He was drunk at the time and had not realised he had it, so he had not known he was actually stabbing Henry, assuming he was just punching him in the back. This, I believe, was an attempt to suggest that William had not known what he was doing at the time of the attack, in the hope of reducing the crime to the lesser manslaughter. The magistrates quickly dismissed the appeal, stating that they felt there were no grounds for the jury to reduce their verdict to manslaughter. They also refused to allow James Innes to give evidence, stating that he could have done so at the trial but chose not to. This meant that the execution of William Cavanagh would go ahead as planned on December the 18th, 1917. William's solicitors had one last chance, and that was a letter to the Home Secretary in the hope of a reprieve, but this too was denied in a letter that was sent to the solicitors on December the 15th. Normally at this point I would mention those who had visited William while he was in prison. However, there were no real details about this, so we can only assume that perhaps Ruby and James did visit him before the execution. He did, however, receive regular visits from the prison chaplain. On the day of the execution, William arose early and was attended by the Reverend Father Thorman. There are no details as to whether William ate before his execution. However, it does seem that he had previously eaten well, as it was suggested that he had gained quite a lot of weight since his arrest. A little before 8 a.m, Thomas Pierpoint, the executioner, arrived to pinion William. This means that his arms would be tied at the wrists. Thomas Pierpoint was the brother of Henry and had taken over from him when he had retired from the job in 1910. The Pierpoint family were well known in this line of work, with the two brothers and later their nephew all working as hangmen. After the pinioning, William was led to the gallows. It was said that he walked calmly and firmly without need of assistance from the prison guards. He also stepped onto the drop without any help. There are no details as to whether or not he confessed to his crime just prior to his execution, but I somehow suspect that he did not. Thomas Pierpoint adjusted the rope and placed the white cap over the head of William Cavanagh, and the signal was given to release the bolt, and William fell. His death was said to be instantaneous. Only a small crowd had gathered outside of the prison to witness the execution, although they would not, of course, be able to see anything. The crowd was estimated at only around 70 or 80 people, and it was said that they quickly moved on after hearing the prison bell ringing to signify that the execution had taken place. After the usual time of 1 hour, the body of William was removed, and he was later buried within the grounds of Newcastle Prison. This was usually a spot near the exercise yard, and it would be carefully covered so that no one would know a burial had recently taken place. I am sure many of you will have heard me mention the Felon's Plot in some other stories. This was a mass grave located in All Saints Cemetery that was used to rebury those who had previously been buried within the walls of Newcastle Prison when it was demolished in 1925. William was one of those who was reburied in the cemetery. As I have mentioned before, 4 bodies out of the 15 who were hanged and buried in the prison grounds between 1844 and 1919 were never found. However, I did read recently that another body was found in 1928, but there seems to be no evidence to support it being one of those missing bodies. I have found no details for either James or Ruby to suggest that what became of them after the trial. So if anyone listening knows anything about them, do please let me know in the comments below. This is another very sad and tragic story. Once again, drink has played a very big part in the sad loss of 2 young lives. Had the men and women not been drinking so much, the argument may not have taken place, and both Henry Hollier and William Cavanagh may have lived. However, I have to add here that it seems doubtful that William would have gone on to live a good life. His past suggests that he would have spent many more years in prison. I do hope that you have found this sad and tragic story interesting. Do let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And please do forgive me for a couple of mistakes. I know that at one point I did call Henry Arthur. His middle name was actually Arthur, so this is probably why I did that. It was purely accidental, and I do hope that it hasn't spoilt your viewing. So thank you all very much for watching, and I do hope to see you all again very soon.